Hello, my name is Emily Dunkler, and I'm going to talk to you guys about immigration policies that have happened throughout the United States. Okay, so first we're just going to cover what is immigration. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it is to enter and usually become established, especially to come into a country of which one is not native for permanent residence. So just when you come to a new country with the intent to live there eventually. So another important thing that we should probably define is the difference between a visa and a green card, because those are different. And honestly, before I got into this, I didn't realize that they were different, so that's kind of why I'm covering this. So what a visa is a kind of like a stamp that they put into your passport, and it just says you're allowed to enter that country that you're trying to get into. You just present it at the border of whatever country you're trying to go to, and it either allows you to enter or doesn't allow you to enter. They expire after so many months or something like that, and you have to reapply to them because they are not for permanent residence, they're only temporary. And then a green card is what you would get when you become a lawful permanent resident. So after you've established yourself inside of a new country, you'll go through all the processes and application steps that you need to be able to get this card. And it kind of is just like a driver's license. It's a plastic IT card, just the same as a driver's license is. So the main difference between them is that visas allow you to visit, and green cards really don't. They don't necessarily require that you are allowed access into a country just because you have a green card. And then green cards allow you to live permanently in a residence, whereas visas do not. So I'm just gonna kind of go over the different immigration policies that I found that happened throughout the different United States. So the first one that I found was the open door immigration policy, and a lot of people just kind of assume that, oh, open door, anybody who's anybody can get in, no problems asked, which really isn't the case. Kenneth Michael White writes in his article, Declaration of Independence and Immigration in the United States of America, that for those who qualified under property, ethnic, or gender classifications were the only ones who were really allowed to get in. So even though they say, oh, anybody can get in, you still have to be a certain type of person to be able to get in. White also writes in the same article, for both legal and illegal immigrants, America's actions have been inconsistent and often racist, which is where we kind of see where people are coming to the border thinking, oh, it's open immigration, I can just come and live here, and they're turned away because they don't fit what we're looking for, different things like that. The second immigration policy that I looked at was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This legislation created barred zones for Asian immigrants, and it kind of created a system of quotas for how many of different types of immigrants were allowed to come into the United States. So in 1921 and 1924 was when that quota was established, and it basically just said only so many Asians, Southern and Eastern Europeans were allowed to come in. So it really limited the Greeks, the Poles, and the Russians from being able to come in in large numbers like other countries were potentially able to at that time. It was also during the late 1800s and the early 1900s that the first drug laws were kind of created or established. These laws were mostly directed at Chinese railroad workers who were suspected of creating opium dens, and so they were kind of putting the wall up there, be oh, well, these people shouldn't come into our country because they're just bringing drugs. So that was kind of where that argument started, was all the way back in the late 1800s. So then the next one was the United States Border Patrol. And basically what that was it just blocked illegal immigrants from coming into the United States from Mexico. And then the Marijuana Tax Act was kind of second fold to that, and it was the drug policy to go hand in hand with the United States Border Patrol, and it was also designed to keep Hispanics and Mexicans out of the United States. So then kind of in the middle era, we have it really wasn't like a act or anything like that, but I thought it was worth noting. The 1942 guest worker program, which allowed Mexicans to come into the United States and farmland that we had. And it wasn't really like an act or anything like legally that was written down, but it was just kind of like, they can come over here and farm for us because we need the help. And then the Immigration and Nationality Act kind of changed that, put a stop to it kind of thing, and it changed the quota from earlier with the Asian, Southern, and Eastern Europeans, where it kind of limited those groups. It then began it began favoring the Northern Europeans, so more Northern Europeans were allowed to come in, but it also began putting a stop to the Mexicans coming over to farm U.S. soil and limited them to just farming in Texas. Then we have Operation Wetback. This moved 500 of the Canadian border officers down to the Mexican border, and over the course of time, they eventually removed over 1 million Mexican immigrants back to Mexico from the United States just from Operation Wetback. And then in 1965, the immigration reform. This too, I don't believe was like an official act. I believe it was just kind of like something that was stated in this article that White had written that I thought was worth noting. During this time in 1965, Europeans started, not coming over to America quite as much, and Southern America and developing countries started coming to America more. So their immigration spiked to the United States, while Europe and other countries of that sort that had spiked in past had kind of started to dwindle. And this was like kind of made to kind of help like stop illegal immigration, because it kind of almost made it like more open for other people, but then as we can see now, it certainly did not stop it. And then we also have the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and this gave amnesty to illegal immigrants that were already in the country at the time of the act being imposed. And then it imposed sanctions on employers who hired undocumented workers. So basically what that means was they were allowed to stay here. However, if they were found to be illegal and not making steps to be legal, then anybody who tried to like hire them for like cheap labor, which is typically what was going on with these immigrant workers, employers of the workers were then fined or, words. Okay, so currently, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, that doubled the size of the Border Patrol that was splitting the United States and Mexico. It created over 600 new immigration naturalization services and investigative agents. And they also implemented the use of different types of technology on the border, such as like motion control and like motion sensors, to try and help patrol the border to stop and limit as many illegal immigrants that were coming over as possible. The illegal immigration reform also made it easier to deport persons without proper paperwork or false paperwork. So if they didn't have the green card or weren't making steps to get the green card, or were found to have not authentic ones, then they could have been deported back to Mexico had they been found. Or not even necessarily Mexico, wherever they were from. But this was mostly directed at Mexicans because that was just where the influx was coming from at the time. And then Proposition 187 was only in California. It wasn't a state, or national-wide thing. It was just a California statewide thing. It denied illegal immigrants public education and emergency public health services. So basically, if any type of immigrant, got sick or needed any type of health care or anything like that, and they weren't making strides to becoming legal citizens, they weren't allowed to get that help that they needed, no matter how severe it was, as well as education. They were denied that right. And then we come to the DREAM Act, which DREAM stands for Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors. It basically provided a way for children that came over with their families whenever they immigrated to the United States. It kind of just made a way for them to be able to a little bit easier of a way for them to become of legal status. It allowed for current, former, and future undocumented high school graduates and GED recipients to be able to kind of move through this process. There is a three-step pathway that I'm going to go over as soon as I cover DACA, excuse me, I don't know how to properly pronounce that acronym, but yeah. So then DACA, which stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, is a little bit similar to the DREAM Act, but still independent on its own. It was kind of like a temporary relief form for the deportation of child immigrants that came over with their families. It authorized work to certain young undocumented immigrants that were brought to the United States as children. So, unfortunately, however, this program was canceled on September 5th of this year, and no more applicants were allowed to be applied after October 5th, and so when it expires, no more new applicants will be able to apply. But to go on to the Dreamers Act, so the first step into becoming a conditional permanent residence, So you can have a CPR, which is the conditional permanent residence, for up to 8 years if you entered under the age of 18, you entered 4 years before the Dreamers Act was put in place, and if you have been in the United States consistently for those 4 years. You can't have any crime conviction or stay in any prison for more than a year. So like minor things like speeding tickets and those types of things won't necessarily get you taken off of the Dreamers program or act, excuse me, but major things will. You had to have been accepted into an institution of higher education, obtained a GED or diploma, or enrolled in secondary school that assists students in getting a diploma or GED, so that kind of just shows that you're trying to make strides towards getting educated. The step 2 was lawful permanent residence, or the LPR, or the green card step. So after you can get to this step after completing one of the 3 of either higher ed, which you would have had to complete it for 2 years, 2 years of military work with an honorable discharge, or 3 years of employment work. However, you could apply for a hardship waiver, which basically just says that for whatever reason you couldn't complete any of the above 3 mentioned steps, and if they find that your reason was fallible, like you have a disability or you're taking care of a minor or different things like that, then you would still be able to apply for the LPR or green card and not necessarily have to do any of those things because there were extenuating circumstances. And then the very last step is naturalization. So you would have to maintain the LPR for 5 years and then you could apply. Unfortunately, the Dreamers the Dreamers Act is at risk for being eliminated like DACA, and unfortunately it was the first real step to make immigration available for not necessarily everyone, but everybody that was here at a younger age and kind of really didn't have a say in coming, but still did anyways, and trying to make their lives a little bit easier. So I do have another video that just kind of explains it in probably a better way than I have done butchering this, so we'll watch that.
I remember the day that I found out I was undocumented. I got a call from an admissions office from a university that I had applied to. They wanted to see a green card. I was extremely embarrassed. My mother just started crying. In between her tears, she just started apologizing and told me that it was her fault and that she wanted a better future for us and look at what happened.
That's Juan Escalante. When he was 11 years old, Juan and his family came to the United States from Venezuela, where life had become dangerous.
We were driving, and we stopped at a red light, and a man approached the car, and he told my mother if she doesn't surrender the car to him, he's going to pull out a gun and kill one of her kids in the car right there. We picked up everything, we sold all our toys, and just embarked on this journey.
Juan made it to college and graduated. But because he was undocumented, he couldn't work, and he worried about being deported.
even like a trip to the grocery store, and you get pulled over, and that's it, it's game over.
But that changed in June of 2012.
Effective immediately, the Department of Homeland Security is taking steps to lift the shadow of deportation from these young people.
If you'd come to the U.S. when you were under 16, if you were either in high school or had a high school diploma, and if you had either no criminal record or like a teeny tiny misdemeanor,
then you could apply for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. Basically, a permit that protects you from getting deported and allows you to work legally in the U.S. Juan got this protection, and so did nearly 800,000 others who applied. But now, that protection is gone.
I'm here today to announce that the program known as DACA that was effectuated under the Obama administration is being rescinded.
DACA was designed to protect a generation of young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers, named after a bill called the DREAM Act, which had been floating around Congress for more than a decade, and with bipartisan support. The bill would have given unauthorized immigrants who grew up in the U.S. a way to gain legal status and eventually apply for citizenship. And even though it fell short of 60 Senate votes in 2010, the idea was still popular with the American public.
when President Obama announced DACA, it was in the middle of the 2012 presidential campaign, but it didn't turn into a huge campaign issue because Republicans were really ambivalent about turning immigration into a wedge issue.
We need to help accommodate these kids who, through no fault of their own, find themselves in this legal limbo.
We cannot forever have children who were brought here by their parents when they were small children to live in the shadows.
But in 2014, Obama proposed making older immigrants eligible for DACA and creating similar protections against deportation for undocumented parents with children who were U.S. citizens.
And a lot of Republicans said, whoa, that's too far.
These new actions would have protected about 4.5 million people, nearly half the estimated undocumented population. A group of 26 states sued the Obama administration over the expansion, and they won. A federal judge stopped the DACA expansions from going into effect, hinting that they were probably unconstitutional.
People had started thinking back to, well, if those bigger programs were unconstitutional, what does that say about this DACA program that's already in place?
Then came Donald Trump.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Once Donald Trump became the leading Republican presidential candidate running on an immigration hardline platform, Republicans started to look at things in a new light.
If it weren't for me, you wouldn't even be talking about illegal immigration.
When Trump won, DACA's fate seemed sealed. But even though he revoked lots of Obama's other executive orders on immigration, nearly 8 months into his term, he still hadn't ended DACA.
A lot of the immigration hawks began to go, wait, we were promised that you were going to get rid of this amnesty that exists right now. What the heck happened?
So a bunch of states threatened to sue the government over DACA again if Trump didn't get rid of it, which brings us to early September 2017.
It is my duty to ensure that the law...
A lot of people who only consider themselves to be Americans in limbo for the next several months.
In the 5 years it's been around, DACA has had a big impact on young undocumented immigrants. A survey of DACA recipients found nearly 70% got a job with better pay. More than 60% opened their first bank account. Nearly 65% bought their first car, and a similar share say that they've pursued educational opportunities they previously couldn't. But when these protections expire over the coming weeks, months, or years, they'll be back